Jen Yates, good to see you.
Good to see you, David Parsons.
Want to talk about books with you.
Yes.
Reading is fundamental. This will be like a little bit of a PSA, I feel like.
Right.
Because
I have a reading rainbow shirt. I should have worn it today.
You have a reading rainbow shirt?
Yeah.
We're going to have to pause this, and you're going to have to go get your reading rainbow shirt. Because I really do. I mean, you probably grew up, too, in a culture that was very reading. Like, you talk about reading rainbow, I think about, like, LeVar Burton.
Yeah.
And different celebrities that would have, like, I used to go to the library a lot growing up.
Yep.
With those pictures of some celebrity that would be like, make sure you read. I don't know if that culture exists as much anymore. Maybe.
I mean, I don't know. I was like, I'm not familiar with it just in seeing it when I go to the library with my son. It doesn't feel like it's still there, but I think that, I mean, there are still avenues of it. Like Julie Andrews has a great story podcast where she reads stories, which you could just listen to Julie Andrews for a million years.
Who's
and be
Julie
fine.
Andrews? Is that Sound of Music?
No, yes, but also Mary Poppins.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
She's an actress, like an
Yes.
older actress.
Yes, I feel
Okay.
like now I've maybe gotten it wrong. She was in Sound of Music, and all of my music
Someone
theater
will
friends
inevitably
are
correct us, yeah.
are mad. But
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there were even TV commercials when I was growing up that
Yeah.
were like, make sure you're reading. And I definitely don't want to turn this into like a kids these days don't read thing. But I think just to say out at the beginning what my thought was in talking with you about this subject, Jen, is I know that you post on Instagram these pictures of like, here's the 8 books I read this month. And I'm like, what the fuck? How are you reading this many books?
Yeah.
And you read a lot of novels. And I thought that was really interesting. And it made me think about, okay, well, what's the relationship between someone who reads a lot of novels and their legal work? Because I feel like the person that reads a lot of novels isn't really a common person anymore. It used to be like everybody, I think.
I don't know if it used to be everybody. I know like the current stats are like the average, what would be considered not voracious, but like the average reader who reads more than a book a year. It's like 12 books a year is pretty much the average for somebody who considers themselves a reader. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
So-
God, I don't keep track.
Yeah.
You keep track. You have like an app, right?
I keep track. Yeah. I'm that's why when you said this might be too nerdy, I was like, there is no such thing.
Have you always done that? Kept track of your reading?
I didn't always. I think if I look back, I started it. Well, actually, yes, because I was going to make the joke that I got a lot of personal pan pizzas during the summers growing up because there used to be that Pizza Hut like reading thing where
God.
you
Wow,
would do
yeah.
the reading log. So, I mean, I would do the reading logs in school and everything. I was annoying because I would have like the year's reading log completed like in the first month of school because, yeah, the reading has just always been my escape, like sort of a healthy dissociation into another world and just taking that all in. So
An unhealthy addiction, maybe.
I think it's healthy, right?
Yeah. No,
I don't think people die of reading.
I say that die of reading, have like all sorts of complications in their marriage because of reading. I don't know. I mean, I made that as a joke. I'm more thinking like there does have to be an engine of interest of like wanting to do that.
Yes.
And it seems like with you're like, it's actually a very positive thing for me to escape into books. And I've heard that from a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah. Because I have, I mean, people have different social meters and people meet, like it's a way for me to reset.
Right.
And yes, my family is very attuned to like, oh, she's had a week. And so we're going to just need to leave her alone.
Were your family readers too?
Yeah. Yeah. My sister and I will like swap books back and forth. And
did you grow up in a family?
Yeah. I mean, that was like our big outing would be going every week to the library. And it was also, I kind of link it to, it felt like the first time growing up that you had your own autonomy because nobody was telling me what to read. So, for all of the other control that my parents may have exerted over me, like they didn't monitor what I was reading. They didn't say I couldn't read certain things. And so I just got to grab whatever looked interesting. And that is a real great way to learn about the world.
Yeah. And did you end up reading things that you probably shouldn't have read at a certain age?
Absolutely, yes. I think we've talked about, like, I think I read Helter Skelter in like 5th grade.
Right, the
That
true
was
crime stuff.
probably not age appropriate.
Well, I mean, my freshman year, and this is to speak to like how the internet has changed things because didn't have the internet when I was in high school. And so I was curious about things like murder and things that you're not supposed to talk about, violence mainly, sex and violence, I'd say, were the main things at 13, 14. But like when I went to high school, the first day of high school, I went to the library and they had books that they didn't have at the junior high school library, including Stephen King books. And I think my first week, I started reading Stephen King, and like that was the entryway into a whole world of adult subjects that I encountered alone, by myself,
Right.
with no sense of shame. And I guess, kids can find that sex and violence fix on the internet now without having to go to a novel, and that's kind of disturbing.
Yeah, it's almost too easy because there is still is still the work of reading through it and processing it, and the difference of reading it and having an interpretation of it in your head versus seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
That's always the difference with the movies and the TV violence versus whatever is on the page for me. Like I can tolerate a whole lot of real awfulness on the page, but that's not going to be what I'm watching on TV.
That's I think a really key idea, actually. And my wife Claudia is a big reader too, and a huge Stephen King person, and reads all sorts of just horrific shit. And then we watch something on Netflix or whatever, and she's just cannot tolerate it at all. And I'm like, you read the most awful shit of these books, but it's different, right?
Yeah, no, Nick does the same thing. He's like, why are you leaving the room? I was like, I literally can't right now. He's like, I read the description of the novel you are currently reading, and it is way worse than this. I was like, I know, but I'm building what it looks like in my head based on how it's described, and that just feels safer to my brain, I think, than somebody else's interpretation on a screen.
Yeah, it gives you control of it in some way. And yet, like, I'm thinking of some instances of sex and violence in Stephen King books that I read many years ago when I was a kid. I still remember them. They still
Oh, I've had like physical reactions to reading stuff where you're just like, oh my God. And so I can't imagine seeing that on the screen. Like, it's actually the reason I didn't watch The Handmaid's Tale, because I remember reading that book.
Oh, yeah.
And like, you're like, I think I know where this is going, and that's going to be terrible. And like, I just was like in the fetal position for like a solid hour after that section of the book. And I'm like, I can't, there's no way I can watch that. There's just no way.
Fetal position, good pun for Handmaid's Tale. But yeah, I feel that too. And I when I was younger, I used to crave, transgressive, violent movies, things like that. And as I get older, I just don't have the tolerance for it. I just like don't care. I don't want to be brought into, I call it like sadness porn or tragedy porn, the sort of like movies that are just like relentlessly depressing.
Yes.
And yet books, I can sort of tolerate that a little bit more. It's weird. It's like there's a certain kind of control you have over it.
Yeah, I think that.
I saw this clip from Sarah Jessica Parker at like the 92nd Street Y, one of those panels talking about her life. And she said that when she was young, her family wouldn't let them leave the house. Like the kids couldn't leave the house if they didn't have a book. Like, do you have a book? Like, it was like making sure you had a sweater.
Yes.
And I was like, that is odd. Like, to me, like the outlier is the family that reads like that. I feel like 99%, I don't know what the statistics are, but it feels like there's fewer people who read for pleasure. And I was just reading this this piece by a lawyer online, her blog, where she said lawyers have a struggle reading for pleasure.
Yeah.
Because there's so much reading and so much material you do as a lawyer. What's your experience with that?
I was gonna say most of my friends, especially in law school, like Jason France, our other one of our family law associates, would give me such a hard time. He's like, I don't understand how you can like read what we need to read for class every day, and then you're still voluntarily reading like a novel at night. And I was like, yeah, because that's just how I have to reset. But yeah, most I have a couple of friends, like we have a mom's lawyers book club that I'm in, so there's some level of that, because I think it is an escape for a lot of people. But I would say by and large, most of my lawyer friends look at me with a little bit of side eye about like voluntarily reading after hours, after having to read all day.
Yeah, no, I feel that. And I felt that as a little bit of a tragedy in graduate school for history, because I was reading all these history books, and then just like, well, actually sort of reading some history books for pleasure, I guess, a little bit. And I'm dropping off from that practice of like those summers, those Pizza Hut summers, where you're just like sort of reading because you're just reading exactly what you want to, and not necessarily thinking like, oh, this is going to enrich me or add to my career in some way.
Yeah.
I do wonder though, do you think it makes you a better lawyer to read novels? Because I have a theory.
David has a
Well,
theory.
no, I mean, the theory is not much of a theory. It's just I think if people read novels are better at communicating, have a more of a control of the English language, have a wider vocabulary. I say this because my dad started reading novels since he retired, and I've listened to him on the phone. My dad's just smarter now. Like he just, because he reads all the time, he doesn't have those Joe Biden moments where he's like, like he just seems smarter to me. And I wonder what's your experience with reading novels? Do you think it makes you a better lawyer in some way?
Well, I was like, Jennifer has a theory too. I think it just makes me a better person. Mm-hmm. I think it gives people who read, I think, have a lot of empathy, because you are, through that story, living in a situation that you would probably never experience otherwise, especially if you're reading like a wide variety of authors and backgrounds and that type of thing. So, I mean, my go-to is always like a murder mystery. My sister gives me a hard time because she's like, ugh, I've had a hard week. I need something light and fluffy. I was like, ooh, I just started this great like serial killer novel. She's like, what is wrong with you? But if you read like just different stories, different people, different backgrounds, and you can understand it. I mean, it's living it without living it. And so then when you're in situations like in cases where people are telling you stuff, like I've never lived that particular type of life, but sometimes I have, because I've read something similar, or I can understand that point of view from having seen it through a fictional novel, or, I mean, even nonfiction work, but the fiction because of the storytelling. And I think it helps you try and come up with a better way to tell a story, because when you read a lot of different ways of telling stories, like I just finished one and it was this great, like there's 4 different viewpoints that you follow over different periods of time, and they all end up connecting, but you don't, like you're partway through the second one and before you kind of figure out like, I think there's a connection, but when you get it at the end and you're like, that was great. Like I got all of the information. They got you 80% of the way there to make some assumptions about what was going on. And then when they laid it out there, you were like, oh, that was great. And so thinking about different ways to explain things, to draw in the audience, to make sure they're actually reading what you're putting out there. I mean, you can't, it's still a legal document. It's not like I can make it beautiful and
that's true, but
breaking, but
it makes me think a lot about how much of lawyering is storytelling in one way or the other.
Yeah. And so much of storytelling ends up being, at least in the legal context, knowing the ultimate audience, because then you can tailor the story better. So, and
it could be the judge, could be a jury.
Yeah. I mean,
could be the other people on the other side.
Yeah.
Like who you're talking to.
And sometimes it's all of that interwoven. I think what's probably frustrating for most of the clients is most of the time I'm not telling the story for them, because they want a different version of it. And I was like, I get that, but we've got to weave in knowing the other points of view that the judge is going to see. So you're trying to help tie some things together. And if you can pull that in and weave that through with what you're saying. So there's some of that.
Yeah, you're a narrator in a sense.
Yeah.
And like a narrator that is a very particular kind of narrator too. Like not like, I feel like, I don't want to go too far in this metaphor, but like it seems like the clients are like, they're telling their like sort of subjective first person story.
Yes.
And you're like the voice of God a little bit narrator. That's more like, let me step back and tell the story in its complete way, or at least one side in its more complete way.
Right.
If that makes sense. Wow. Writing is part of being a lawyer as well.
Yes.
And I'm taking writing class this summer, legal writing. I did not expect it to be as, as rigorous as it is. And I think all of us have been like, oh, we're all of a sudden writing a lot.
Yeah.
And I feel like there are a lot of students who are struggling in the class with writing. and I want to ask them how much they read, because I feel like there's a relationship there between like how much you read and how fast you can just sort of like write a paragraph. Do you feel that at all? That like this like improves your language skills to read? I know you read mystery novels, but like
Yeah.
there's language there, right?
There's
like
language. Yeah. I was like, I'm trying to think of the best answer to that. But I like when I'm writing something, like I joke with everybody all the time because I'll usually have like the random 3 a.m. thoughts, but I'm usually like drafting and outlining it kind of in my head so that by the time I sit down to actually type it out, it's almost like a fugue state of like I have processed it so many different ways of how I want to connect the threads that then I can just sit and go through and do it. And I mean, it's not like it's a novel. It's a 5 or 10 page declaration, but still like I can just kind of go. And even when I'm reviewing something somebody else has done, like I can look at it and I've thought about it so much that I can move stuff around so that it has the flow that I'm looking for. I don't know how much of that is tied.
It totally
reading,
is, dude.
but-
I mean, if you're a fast reader,
Yes.
right?
Right.
It sounds like you're a fast reader.
I am, yeah.
You can sort of get the main topic of something, the main idea of a text quickly, it seems like. And that's like a huge skill for lawyering because you have to like read these cases and be like, what's the fucking gist of this?
Right.
Right?
Yes,
Like,
because they will go on.
yeah. And I mean, so the assignments that we're being given this summer are like, for the next hour, I want you to write this. And here's like 3 cases. And I want you to like read these cases and like write a little memo that tells your colleague why these cases are important. So it's a basic exercise in like literally reading for the main point.
Right.
And I feel like there are a lot of people that take a lot of time to do that. And I'm wondering, what is it those people could do to get faster? And I'm like, the only advice I have is just read a lot. Like, that's the only advice I have. I don't really
get comfortable with the structure of paragraphs. I mean, and legal writing comes down to, it is boring because it is issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, and like on repeat. So for each
statement
thing,
of facts, discussion, analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that also, if growing up, I mean, I was always really great at the essay. When you had to do like an essay in class, I could do an essay on anything. I didn't have to know about it. Like I could just knock it out, get a good grade. It was fine.
Yeah.
I could do that at 3 a.m. and when it was due at 8 a.m.
It's because you read a lot.
Problem.
That's my only
This is your
theory here. Yeah.
It's David's theory.
Well, I mean, I read the New York. I realize I say I read a lot, but I read the New York Times a lot. Like I read that style of writing, which I think is really good for like legal writing because it's just like economy of language.
Yes.
And so like reading the New York Times, I'm just ready to write like that all the time. It becomes a part of you.
Yeah, that is my husband's and my dispute because I read a lot of books, novels. He reads just a lot of article, like New York, like all the articles and those types of things. And so like we probably read the same, just the way that I can quantify it is I have this list of books that I read this year.
Right.
And, it's not the same.
Yeah, but reading novels, like reading like murder mysteries.
Yeah.
Right? Like you don't work murder cases, really. But in some way the murder mystery is connecting to your work, I feel like.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I don't steer away from the legal novels as much as I steer away from like legal TV. And I think some of it is because if it's done well, there's not as many of those moments where you're taken out of it because you're like, that's not what happens. That's annoying.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting to me. Because I mean, one of the things that every professor said over and over again is being a lawyer is not like anything you see on the movies or TV.
Right.
You have this weird idea of how court works from Law and Order and everything else. It's not like that. But you're saying that novels get closer?
I think
sometimes?
novels get closer, and I just think it's because they're able to build it out. Like the thing about movies and TV is you're in this really confined amount of time. You're trying to make it interesting so people aren't like just on their phones and having you in the background. So you're trying to capture attention. And not that novels aren't trying to do that, but they're doing it in a different way because you're fleshing more things out. You're being more descriptive. You're having to draw people in that way. And if you have the time, then you can probably not take some of the shortcuts that I think TV and movies do, which is when, you throw up your hands. I mean, reading fiction is still suspending some belief, especially when you start to get into like fantasy, sci-fi, like some speculative literary fiction type things. You have to suspend reality. So there's still that suspension of it, but I find myself pulled out less in books.
That's interesting. Did you read like John Grisham novels? Did you read any of those?
I read a couple. Yeah, I've
So I'm wondering now. I haven't read them in so long. I'm wondering now what they would be like.
I don't know what they would be like now because the last time I probably touched one was 20 years ago or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of not where my reading trajectory took me,
but those are so fucking popular.
Yeah.
Like that lawyer, like
yes.
Grisham doesn't do Lincoln Lawyer, but like Lincoln Lawyer is another series.
Yeah, I think is that Connolly?
Yeah, and then Matthew McConaughey was in the movie of it. I haven't seen any of this stuff. My dad reads a lot of this stuff. The legal thriller. It's like such a genre. Like it's huge, obviously. I mean, Law and Order, the TV show, is one of the most popular shows of all time. Yeah. It's interesting to me that like people have this like fictional sort of world of the like legal sort of. Like most people have very little idea of how any of it really works. But I guess the people who read might have slightly.
I mean, I think I probably also veer towards the ones that are written by people who actually have some legal experience. Like I think one of the best books I read pulled this together beautifully because they would have a chapter and it was like the transcript of the court testimony. And then I can't remember if it was the chapter. I think it was the chapter after it would be then from that person's point of view when the incident was actually happening.
Yeah.
So you could see how much was being withheld, how much was being, zhuzhed around because they didn't want to say like this thing that really happened because they didn't think it was important to the main thing. Like it was just this master class. And so the author, Angie Kim, and the book was Miracle Creek. She went to Harvard Law School. I don't know how long if she actually practiced, but she had like some understanding of the true legal setting.
Yeah.
And it was, I just remember putting the book down and just being like, wow.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's a good recommendation.
Yeah.
Because I say that legal thriller genre is popular, and I'm sure the more pulpy it becomes, the less real, whatever that means it is. But there are, it sounds like, novels that are written by lawyers or people who have been in the legal world that are doing something a little more, I don't know, a little more practiced, a little more sort of like, here's how things actually work.
Yeah. Or they're putting in the research. I'm going to forget now, but I remember reading like the afterword that an author wrote thanking somebody or thanking a bunch of people for an area that she was unfamiliar with. And she was like, I got to run it by them, so it made it more authentic. And I can't remember what it was at the time because it's probably been a couple years since I read it. But I like during it, you were like, this feels real.
Yeah.
And that well-researched, not just, I'm writing a bunch of words to knock out this deadline.
Well, there's also I feel like when you're writing a novel like that, I'd be like, well, the more real I make it, the less like story exciting it might be. And so like balancing those two things is really hard.
Things that have really happened, or I mean, even in my cases, some of my cases, I'm like, this is so much more interesting than anything you could make up, like given any parameters. Like this is infinitely more interesting. So a lot of times taking those pieces from history or from specific things that seem on their face boring, you can really build it out and make it interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the sort of authenticity of stories sometimes is the exciting part of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that part of it is like, oh, the fact that I'm learning how things are actually working here. It's funny to be talking about this in Ventura, California, because of the history of legal novels intersects here with Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote and created the character Perry Mason. And I've been kind of reading back, and I haven't read the entire thing. I'm sort of in the middle of reading his memoir and about his life writing these novels. But the basic idea is like he was a lawyer who decided to write stories. And when he decided to write stories, he kind of like took his legal knowledge and took his trials and all the things that he'd worked on here in Ventura County and sort of like exaggerated them and made them into like really pulpy, crazy stories. He didn't write any of it like physically. He did it all like we're doing right now, like with a recorder.
Oh.
So it's like, imagine if I said, Jen, just tell me a story. And you're going to be like, okay, a guy walks into a bar basically, more or less. And he would do that. And to me, I was like, wow, that sounds like such an interesting practice of writing, of literally like just telling your stories from your legal world, but telling them like with embellishments and exaggeration. And there you have a novel.
Well, and it was probably a lot easier because in the old school days, which were not that long ago, in the law, I mean, that's how lawyers would dictate work to their staff, is they would literally dictate it. They'd walk around with, these little mini recorders. And I mean, I remember getting them from my boss when I was in law school. It would just drop the cassette tape on the corner of my desk and you had to like listen to it and type everything up. So for him, that probably felt real natural to just sit there with a recorder and talk into it and tell whatever he needed to get down.
And the poor secretary that has to type all of that up. And he had like a team of like ladies who like type these stories.
I imagine, yeah.
And then my thought always is kind of like, okay, wait a second. Because the women that are writing these stories, they were always the same women and they knew the stories really well. They became almost like half of his mind in a lot of ways. And I thought about like, how much are they the authors of these stories in some ways? Because he's just dictating, this should happen, that should happen. But they're really the ones that are forming this into a book. And it, like, I don't know, it just makes me think a lot about sort of like who wrote these books really.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always a team effort, because you could say that about editors too. Like, you can tell when a book did not have a good editor. And there are plenty of times where I've been frustrated. I'm like, I can't anymore with this book. Like, you wasted my time, because it was a great premise, but it needed some molding. So, but it's the whole team effort is, I think, what makes them the most successful.
How do you find good novels to read? Like, where's your store of good books? I think a lot of people who don't read, who want to read, are sort of like, I don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
Like, where do you find books? Because I don't know. There's like, it's a huge world.
It is a huge world. So diving even deeper into my nerddom, I follow like a couple of sites and listen to some podcasts specifically. Most of where I get stuff is from Book Riot. They have
RIOT?
Yes, Riot.
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 Yeah, okay.
We're gonna riot in the streets.
Yes.
They have a lot of great specific podcasts. So like if you're into murder mysteries, if you're into sci-fi, like they have people who are just into it. I also I have this service that quarterly that will send me recommendations of new books that have come out that seem in my wheelhouse or maybe a little bit connected to it, but something new that I may not have picked up on my own, because sometimes you get in like your little bubble about it. So because I track what I read, I also have like a list of things I want to read. So I can always kind of go to that. Like if I'm at the library or a used bookstore, I'm like, oh, I was kind of in the mood for this. I wonder if they have that here, or what was in my TBR that I wanted to read that maybe is a few years older or something. So I guess it's a little bit of work. It doesn't feel like it, but I get, those newsletters, those podcasts. And so it gives you ideas or connections, and or sometimes it's just like an automatic buy. So like Angie Kim actually just had another book that came out this year. I didn't care what it was about because I loved her debut novel so much that I was like, yep, no, you have a new novel. I have Amor Towles is another one. I don't care what the description of it is. If he has a new book, I will buy it and I will read it and I will probably love it. So
are these legal books?
Amor Towles isn't. I mean, so Angie Kim her new one is also like a different take, but kind of in that same world with the missing person situation. But Amor Towles did A Gentleman in Moscow, which they just did a Hulu, I think, show about that, which was also very good. But he's more of it's hard to describe. It sounds really boring when you actually describe it, because like Gentleman in Moscow was about after the Russian Civil War, this count was sentenced to having to live in this hotel for the rest of his life, like in exchange for not being executed. That was the deal. And he lived in this, they moved him to the staff quarters out of like the fancy suite that he was in, and they took all of his money. And so like that premise, you're like, great. How is that a 500-page book? But you get into it, and it's just one of those, like, you're drinking in the descriptions, you're like there. It's like vibes. You're just like, I'm in. I don't even care where you're taking me. This is great. So
do you read sci-fi or things that are out of the quote unquote real world?
I do, yeah. So I read some, I call it like light fantasy. It's probably not light fantasy because once you start involving like dragons and magic, that's probably no longer light.
Yeah, I always think of it as like if there are dragons.
If there are dragons, then right, you're fully in fantasy. I don't do sci-fi as much. I will dip into it, but I don't know what it is. I don't like the space stuff. My husband loves it. So this is like one of our divergent paths where he's like, you don't understand. Like his favorite movie is Interstellar. And I was like, okay.
It's a pretty good movie.
Yeah.
It's grown on me over the years.
Yeah.
I would like to read a book like that. You know what I mean? Like I don't need to read a lot of space stuff either. But
yeah.
now that I think
It's not my vibe. Although I hear Andy Weir is really good if that is your vibe. So you might want to check him out.
Is that the guy who wrote Martian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I started reading that. It was way too sciencey for me.
Yeah. See, I think that might be it with sci-fi too. Like I appreciate science, but it's not my go-to unless we're talking like forensic science.
You know who was really good at that is Michael Crichton. Like,
yeah, I do. I have enjoyed most of the Michael Crichton I've read
because he writes deep science shit, and I was never a science person really, but I felt like he did a good job of bringing that. I mean, obviously he was popular partly for that reason. I think.
Yeah. I remember
Dino DNA.
I was going to say, I remember, I think at junior high, maybe high school, Andromeda Strain. Like, I loved that. I don't think I should revisit that because it's probably too close to home with the COVID situation that happened. But
I just picked up the new like George Romero, the guy that did all the like Night of the Living Dead like zombie movies.
Yeah.
So right before he died, he like wrote this giant zombie novel that's called like The Living Dead or something like that. It's kind of like takes place within like COVID and Trump world, but it's zombies and pandemic and all that kind of shit. And it's just, it's like reading the news, honestly.
Yeah.
It's very close to that.
Yeah.
And I don't read a lot of horror stuff, but it just like bringing me back to The Stand and Stephen King and reading all of that stuff early on.
yeah,
That kind of like, I don't know, the fun, gory, morbid story.
I know. I think I have to trust the author on that. There's another author that, doesn't matter what it is, I'll buy it. Riley Sager. And it's great because it's fun. He takes like all of the tropes, so like the first book, I think his first book was Final Girls. So it was, a support group basically of final girls from not slasher films, but that was the slasher film thing. And he makes it's like tongue in cheek, but it's also really well done. And so each of his have kind of been one of those tropes. There's the you're alone in the cabin in
Love
the middle
that.
of the
Yep.
yeah.
Because you've seen all these tropes so many times.
Yes.
Like at this point, it's like we've gone so far past like anything postmodern. It's sort of like you feel like it has to subvert that somehow, or else why would I care?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that's where, and more recently, the speculative fiction where the authors are just doing weird shit and you're not really sure what's going on, but it's interesting enough, and if it's well executed, you're just like, I don't even know what just happened, but that was a ride and I'm here for it.
Right. But it has to be written. I don't know. For me, like I picked, there was another Tender is the Flesh. I picked it up. It's one of those book talk books.
Yeah.
TikTok books. And, I don't remember the author's name, but I didn't finish it in part because I was like so disappointed in the language.
Yeah.
It was just written in such a plodding, boring, obvious way that it just, I don't know. I don't know if that's like the TikTok book thing or what it is, but
well,
there is a kind of generation that's reading certain types of books on TikTok.
It had a great cover because I can visualize the cover, but that's what makes, I think, a good book talk.
Because
talk.
it's about it's really gory and nasty. It's about people eating each other.
Yeah.
It's a cannibal book.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, that'll be fun. But it wasn't fun.
No.
It was actually really heavy-handed. It was like, this is how human beings are. You know, like that kind of shit.
That makes it a little rough. Yeah, I don't usually take recommendations from Book Talk because I feel so much like, and I mean, I do this when I post books on Instagram because I was like, this cover is pretty, but I was like, but I also really enjoyed the book. I feel like it ends up being more about the aesthetic of the cover than about really what the book is. That may be unfair, but that's what
the aesthetic of the
feels
take.
like. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It feels, and I'm not so I'm speaking ignorantly perhaps because I haven't spent a whole lot of time on Book Talk, but we're talking about TikTok book thing.
Yeah.
It's TOK. But when I go to Barnes and Noble a lot. Like I love Barnes and Noble, walking around just looking at what they've got on the tables, and they've got all these TikTok tables.
Yeah,
where they're like, hey, TikTok kids. Seems like a lot of the TikTok kids, the younger people, are reading like crazy speculative fiction, a lot of like weird like fantasy stuff, and like that to me, that's a world I'm never gonna be in. But like then there are those other novels that are like, yeah, this Tender is the Flesh one. I think it's an Argentinian author, a woman who's like well known for writing some other horror stuff. So I was like, oh, this isn't gonna be a kid's book, but it felt
like it's disappointing. I've gotten much better. I used to refuse to not finish a book. Like once I started it, I had to finish it no matter what the slog was. Unfortunately, as I've aged, I was like, I don't have time for this shit. I'm out. Like I'll give you 50 to 100 pages, but if I'm not in by that point, I'm gonna have to move on.
How often does that happen to you lately?
Not very. It used to happen a lot more, and I think it was just because I wouldn't pay attention, or I would get sucked in by like the blurb, and the blurb doesn't mean anything. It's just, some other author that I was like, "Ooh, I like that author." So if they liked
the blurb gets you.
The blurb is dumb to pick books off of. It's like picking it off the cover is better than the blurb most of the time. So I stopped doing that.
Stephen King says mesmerizing, and I'm like, oh, gotta get it.
Yeah. So I have like some of the people I follow. I'm like, if they loved this, then I will love it. Like I will trust the more personal recommendation. And a lot of them used to be booksellers. So it's like that hand sell, but through the podcast or something else. And I go to our local bookstore here at Tamber a lot. And I think they kind of know.
You pronounced it correctly.
I did.
That's weird. It's bold to me that they named their...
I know. I had that thought when I was like, okay, well, I know how to say that, but I don't think that that's how anybody's going to say it.
Because you're a reader. Actually, that's not true. Because
I will mess up words because you read them and you're like, oh, that's what that sounds like. And then I think I still remember this. I was like a teenager, but I said facade instead of facade because I'd read it.
Like, well, it's kind of a facade.
I know. I knew what it was, but I didn't know how to say it. And the person just looked at me and I was like, oh, I said that wrong. And I know that immediately.
I love that because it's what a weird and ironic thing, because you're sitting there like, I'm reading and I'm learning this new vocabulary, but I didn't hear someone say it.
No.
So yeah, I remember using the word superfluous, but I said superfluous, and I said it's probably because it's superfluous, and I think that the teacher like laughed at me, tried not to.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, you should get credit for trying.
Right.
Instead, oh, you don't know how to pronounce it?
Yes.
Stupid.
I made the effort. I know the definition. There are plenty of people who walk around and say the word correctly and don't know what it means.
Yeah.
So.
It's like, I was putting up a facade.
A facade.
That's good. I love that because if you're writing, then facade is there. I think there's a little mark in the C, isn't there?
There is, yes. But I think I didn't know that meant to change how the C would sound.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you read nonfiction too?
Yes.
What's the split? What's the percentage?
It was about like 75-25.
75% novels?
Yeah. And most of the nonfiction that I do read, I actually do like through an audio format. So an Audible book or a Libro book.
Why is nonfiction different?
I think it's more similar to podcasts. And so for me, like I can still get the information. Like I can't do a novel on an audio version. I have tried it. The narrators take me out of it a lot of times. I think maybe the exception was Anne Patchett's most recent novel. Meryl Streep performed it. And
wow.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
And I highly recommend it. So in order to listen to something while I'm running or in the car or something like that, if I don't have a podcast on, then I'll listen to a nonfiction book, and it flows easier for my brain. I mean, I'll read a physical one too, but I will enjoy listening to nonfiction.
That's really interesting. So I've talked with Megan Sherry on this podcast a couple times about reading and writing and sort of the relationship between like hearing things, seeing things, and everyone's brain sort of processes that slightly differently.
Yeah. But
yeah, I'd never really thought about that, but it actually makes sense to me that like a novel I don't know. The audio version of a novel doesn't work as well. In part because it's like that world building thing that happens in your mind, right?
Right, because if it's somebody else's voice, like when you're reading it, it's my voice narrating or how I think the voice should sound. Similarly, I know some people won't watch a movie if they've read the book because they're like, no, this is how these people should look. I don't want to be mad.
He does not look like Channing Tatum. I did not imagine him like Channing Tatum.
No,
I
right.
will not watch this. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I can make that separation, but yeah, I don't. If you have a really great narrator, I think it's fine. But just with the hours I have available to actually listen to it, that's usually my nonfiction time or like business books. Most of the time with the business books, I have like the physical version and the audio version because there's usually charts or graphs or lists that you want to like look at. But so, yeah.
What about that whole thing of like being able to handle, unpleasant stories of violence and things like that? In the nonfiction atmosphere, it's a little different, right? Like reading about savage murders in novels is kind of like, okay, this didn't really happen. But one of the books I picked up last night, which I think is a Hulu, it's called Under the Bridge.
Okay.
It's a true crime story. I don't read a whole lot of these stories, but it's a story of a teenage girl who was killed by a group of other teenage girls in British Columbia in the 90s. And I know it's going to be gut-wrenching. Like, I know this book is going to fuck me up. And it's not going to be pleasant.
Yeah.
And, like, Claudia, when I was buying, she's like, you sure you want to pick that one up? Because, like, I tend to have, like, nightmares and shit from some of this stuff, especially if it's real.
Yeah.
Like, talking with Ron about the Katrina Montgomery case, reading the details of what happened to her, like, fucked me up, really, genuinely. Like, I still think about it. I still think about the room. And you know what? I haven't even seen a picture of the room, but the room is in my mind.
Yeah. You know the room. You
right.
know the rug.
So, like, how do you deal with that? Because is there a difference? Because with nonfiction, I feel like it does affect me when I read it, and I know it really happened.
I think I've just figured, I mean, I'm not saying that I cope with it well. There are plenty of times where like you start something and I'm like, this was a bad choice. Like I started reading.
You're not as sensitive a soul as me, I think. We've established this.
Well, it's funny because my husband and I were talking about that the other night because the power went off at our house and his auto response to it, I forget how he described like the first thing he thinks of. I was like, oh, the first thing I think of is that somebody's intentionally cut off the power so that they can come in here and murder us. He's like, what? I'm like, that is just my automatic assumption. I have to work through that and make sure that there's nobody else in the house because of everything I've read. But I started like the Golden State Killer when I was home alone. Like my husband and son had gone somewhere and I started it at like 10 o'clock at night and it was the worst decision in recent history. Like it was a couple of years ago, but I was just like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to sleep because of how she described, all of the things.
That's the one that
Michelle McNamara,
Patton Oswalt's wife, right? And she died.
Yeah.
Really, like at the end of the story, all that was just amazing.
It was so crazy, and the timing because then within, I think the month that book was released is when they actually arrested him.
She solved the case.
She was
part of solving the case.
Yes, she was part of the team that solved the case, and it was so crazy to me to read through it. But how. This is going to sound creepy, but how beautifully and clearly she described like him entering the house, just those things.
How did she get those details?
I think some of it was from police reports. And then there were, in the early stages, there were people who survived so that they could tell the story. But that just like that sense of creeping foreboding as you're like going through it. I mean, like the opening chapter, I was just like, oh, yeah, I'm not sleeping tonight.
Yeah, right. And nonfiction does that, I think, in a way that fiction doesn't necessarily.
I think it can. But, maybe there is a little bit of that dissociation because you're like, this didn't really happen versus knowing, like, well, this really happened. And some of those locations were not that far from where I currently am. So,
right.
Yeah.
God, I mean, I don't know if you've been following the Gilgo Beach Long Island serial killer thing.
Yes. I read that book 6-7 years ago. There was a book about
so disturbing
before they found him. But.
Yeah. Oh, he's obviously the guy. I mean, when they showed him, I was like, that's the guy. Rex Herman, I think his name is. But like they just released last week, and this is some sick shit, but they just released like his like computer files they had where he's keeping a journal of like the stuff he was doing and what worked and didn't work for next time. And reading that shit, I mean, it's just as real as it gets. It's not even like a secondary source nonfiction. It's like reading this guy's fucking sick journals. That stuff sticks with you.
Yeah.
Because it's like that guy actually did all this shit. Oh, yeah. That's rough. In terms of fiction, though, murder fiction, is it mostly murder fiction that you read? Is it mysteries and crime stuff that you read?
No,
or you read like relationship? Do you ever read like a romance story and things like that?
I don't do romance. Sorry, there was like an audible face for that. No, I don't know what it is. I am sure that's something to work through with my therapist. The romance novels make me so uncomfortable.
I don't think I've read really much romance novels.
Yeah, so if it is marketed as a romance, like I'm not touching it.
That's
probably.
having a huge moment in book talk.
It is
though.
the romanticides.
What romanticides?
Romanticides, because it's like a romance, but it's a fantasy.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
I never even heard that term.
Yes,
romanticides.
See, if you listen to book podcasts, you find out all these fun terms.
I think is there one in Ventura County that there's like a bookstore that's opened recently that's like a love bookstore, like a romanticides maybe.
I
think I saw something about it.
I think you're right. On Main Street, I can't remember.
I didn't pay attention because I'm like, who cares?
Right, yes.
For me, but I know that there's a whole world of that.
Yeah, I think that you are right. I haven't been in because same thing. Like I'm uncomfortable thinking about it, but I kind of go back and forth.
Like enough love, give me the murder.
Yes, I'm a mood reader, so sometimes it just depends. If I need something that's like truly mindless, like a great like police procedural will just set my mind at ease. But I go a little bit all over the place with everything else, and there's just so much these days that are so great. Like last year I read Chain Gang All Stars. I don't know if you heard about this at all. It says a lot probably about me that I really enjoyed it, but it was this future apocalyptic world. Not really, but so they would put people who were in jail would basically it's like gladiator style. They would have these fights and they were televised. It's like this reality TV thing. There's like the story, and so and then there are couples that come out of that because they're fighting together and all of these things. It was like not that far removed. Like you could see that being a thing.
I think that it came up on one of the podcasts with Ron, actually. He talked about like Corcoran State Prison and that there were gladiator fights there in the 90s. And I was like, what the fuck?
So
like,
yeah,
I hadn't heard of
this whole big production and you're following all these different people and like this couple who makes it like their date night to watch the fights. And I mean, it's a fight to the death. So like if you survive like 3 years of doing this, you get your freedom regardless of what your sentence was. And so you're following all these different people and just like thinking about how that seems actually like that could be a thing. It's like, I always joke now, like Idiocracy doesn't feel that far removed from where we are these days. But so reading it, and I was like, it wasn't a murder mystery, it was a commentary on all these different things. I had the greatest footnotes ever. I loved the footnotes. That sounds weird to say, but they were so great. Just how he did them. When they were used sparingly, but like they were important when they were there, and it was great.
It's funny because the more, and this is just like a personal take, and I wonder if this resonates with anyone. It's sort of like the more the world becomes more like Idiocracy, the more the world is like it becomes impossible to make a parody of it because it's like we have like a game show host president, and like everything seems cartoonish already. Yeah. Pandemic. It's like made me less wanting to read that kind of thing where I'm like, oh, it's going to be gladiator fight, unless it's done with like some sort of humor. I think that was what the problem with Tender is the Flesh was for me.
Yeah,
it was humorless.
Yeah.
It was just, look how pulverizing the future is. And I'm like, fuck, man. Like, I can't just be in that register. Like, I'm already in that register. Part of me is like, I want to read like Earl Stanley Gardner novels that take place in a different world. You know what I mean? Like where we're not contemplating.
Like a nice Raymond Chandler noir.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I guess that's an escape too, where you're sort of like, oh, I'm just going to go.
Well, and that's why I think I veer. I know, I veer because when you've finished a really serious book, even if there's some humor in it or, some snark that you can appreciate, like I got to dip back into something that's a little easier. So you have to, can't just do all of one lane.
Yeah, it's a tone thing.
Yeah.
Right? I read. I'm probably the opposite of you in that I read 80% nonfiction and 20% fiction, maybe. Lately, I've just been struggling with reading fiction. I'm just like, I'm back to like, why am I reading this? It never happened.
Right. I was going to say, Nick has the same problem because he's a history major. He's just like, but why are we talking about things that didn't happen? I was like, because sometimes it's a nice break from all the things that did happen, because that's a rough read most of the time too.
Yeah, and who's to say this didn't happen?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Or a version of it. Yeah.
I don't know. What you said at the beginning of this conversation, Jen, about like reading fiction kind of can promote empathy because you're imagining yourself in other people's shoes.
Yeah.
I think that's a really key idea. It's something that I've heard other even authors and writers say is like that's why we read. And I feel like, I don't know, whatever sort of like liberal, progressive reading rainbow thing there is in the culture that was around when we were young and stuff. It's liberals. It's people that want a more empathetic society. It's people who want a society of people that understand each other and be in other people's shoes and that sort of thing. And it feels like all of those authors who are often saying things like that are the kind that are like, let's make the world a better place. I think that's part of what I'm saying. It's like in a general way.
Yeah.
Like that's my wager is if we all read novels, the world might be a better place. I don't know if that's true.
I think it would. Just it takes up more time, so you don't have time to do bad, evil things. If you're sitting there reading.
Well, that's the complaint that I hear from everybody about reading is that they don't have time. What do you think about that? Because you're a pretty busy person, and yet you sit here reading a lot. So
yes.
How do you do that?
I mean, I think it always comes down to, all those time management things. It's how are you spending your time? And it's easy to get sucked in and scroll and flip through, TikTok or Instagram or just sit in front of the TV and zone out. I don't watch a lot of TV unless it's sports pretty much. Like I don't have a bunch of shows that I follow. I don't usually stream a whole thing. What did I just do? I streamed over the weekend like a whole remodeling show about a motel randomly, but it was a one-off. So I don't have a ton
bad
of
weekend.
yeah, I don't have a ton of time. And then it's part of like my wind down routine.
So it's often at night you're reading?
Yeah.
That's
at
how it's
night,
been for
or
me.
go to the beach with the family. I'm not one for the water, so I'm usually just sitting with the stuff and reading. So there are ways to carve it out. I think if it's important to you or if it helps your mental health, that you just figure out a way to carve it out the same way you would with anything.
It sounds like you're saying it does help your mental health.
It does.
Like, tell me about that. Like, it's self-care, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, it allows me, and I think it allows my brain, because my brain is just going all the time. I have, all the thoughts running all the time, and it can be hard to fall asleep. It just allows my brain to like kind of shut off, or that part of my brain to shut off, and just enjoy somebody else's story. Has nothing to do with my life, and so it turns it off for me.
It takes
and
you
that's
out of
great.
yourself,
Yeah,
in a way that I think about this a lot with like self-care. I mean that term, but really just thinking about how to feel better. I don't think TV and movies do that. I don't think they do it in quite the same way.
Yeah.
As much as people like to escape into Netflix, I know when I need to read a book. Like I can be the person that like kind of lets it go for a little while, and I'm just reading stuff for law school and whatever. But I know when I need to read a book, and it's exactly for that purpose, which is like I need to forget myself.
Yeah.
And I don't forget myself quite the same way when I'm flicking through Netflix or watching like stupid shows. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel as restorative or energizing, depending on what it is that you're doing at that particular time. But yeah, that's how I use it. I don't like taking baths. I don't like, it also just doesn't allow you to sit with your own thoughts. Because you have to pay attention to what's going on. So sometimes sitting with my own thoughts is not a good policy.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, like meditation is like trying to like rid yourself of those thoughts,
I know? I struggle.
Yeah.
Every time I try, I was like, this is not for me. This is just not for me. Even when I go to yoga classes, Danielle will go, has this great story. We went to a yoga class together, and it was one of those like mellow, like just intense breathing. And I was just like, when are we going to move? I would like to just be sweating and moving. And that is the yoga that I want to do.
Sometimes you go to yoga and there's like you get more of the like sort of pseudo religious rap from the person than the like physical element of it.
Right. And I want the physical, but Danielle's like, I was sitting next to you. I could just feel your hostility, like at the fact that we were spending half an hour just breathing. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure the room felt it because I was like, this is not for me. This is not what I wanted. I
didn't start meditating or doing any of that, interested in that world until I moved to New York City. And I was like, I need some quiet, like it's so loud here. And it was just kind of like, and for whatever reason, I was at that age. I went to a meditation center. I felt exactly the same way where I was sort of like, what are we doing here? And like, it's just this. Like, it's just sitting.
It's just that.
And it's like, yeah, learn to sit with yourself. But we live in a culture that is the opposite of that.
Right.
I mean, I'm sitting here like reaching for my phone at all times. And it used to be reaching for a pack of cigarettes, right? But either way, it's the same reaching in your pocket because you need something to distract you. I don't know. Part of me sees the value of meditation of like, oh, if you could actually sit with yourself, but
yeah, I am.
It's very
not
hard.
Doubting its benefits. It is not working for me. So,
well, don't you think reading is like meditation a little bit?
Probably, yeah. I was going to say you talked earlier about always having, or Sarah Jessica Parker's family always leaving with. I never go anywhere without a book because even like 5 minutes waiting for a coffee, I can pull the book out. I feel better about it than scrolling through my phone because there's never any good news on my phone.
It's poison. Yeah. It feels that way. I mean, so sometimes if I'm like, in a position where I have to wait somewhere and I don't have a book with me, I'm like, I'm going to scroll through my phone.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to be like, that's going to be a net loss for me at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's weird. I mean, I know that people are listening to audiobooks. There's something about like having a physical book. Are you a Kindle reader or are you a physical book reader?
So my husband was very sneaky in converting me to a Kindle reader because books take up so much space, and for travel, it's the best. So we were going to Chicago, and so around Christmas time. So for Christmas, he got me a Kindle and he downloaded a book he knew I was super stoked to read. I think it was the Justin Cronin book, The Passage. It was like this vampire weird thing.
See, like, you do read stuff that's a little like vampire stuff. Yeah.
But and
vampires aren't real, Jen, just so you know.
I was unaware. I'll have to rethink some things. But yeah, so like on that trip I read it because he's like, you can't take 4 physical books with you. We don't have space in our luggage. Like, this is crazy. This can give you thousands of books. So I dip back and forth, and it's also really easy to get stuff from the library because you can borrow electronic books. So I have physical books, like hardback, mostly hardbacks these days, and then paperbacks. I go back and forth between them all. I usually have one physical book that I'm reading, one Kindle book, and an audiobook that are all kind of going, because then I always have something I can grab.
Wow, you really are a book junkie.
I am.
That's cool. And you can tell. And I feel like if you read people's writing, even their legal writing, you can tell how much they read novels, how much they read in general. Yeah. Like, it's just I don't know. It makes you a more, it makes it easier, I think, to write.
Yes.
And if you're just engaged in language all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think so.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
We'll talk more about books. I feel like I'd like to hear from the Lawyers in the Attic audience about some of this stuff, and like sort of what are the books that they recommend, what the practice of reading, because a practice of reading is something that I feel like is less of a thing in the culture, especially among younger generations.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be LeVar Burton here. I'm going to be the guy that's like, are you reading your books?
You're reading.
Because it's important. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks.